Hey everybody, this is Vegan Theology episode 36 with Kevin and Sarah Hale. And we are vacationing right now on Placid Lake in Montana, and it's gorgeous. Looking at all the ponderosa pines and the lodgepole pines and just enjoying the beauty of Montana.
You might hear some birds, some waterfowl, and some wind chimes, and even a crackling fire in the background. You never know.
Yeah, it's a little cooler for August in Montana.
Most of our family has left, but there are some people creeping around that you might hear in the background. But we're glad to be here. It always feels good to finally make it to the table and hit record.
Right.
And here we go.
Right. And by the way, we do want to say shout out to many of the people who listen to this podcast. We appreciate you. And obviously we're on our own little journey trying to figure out a vegan theology. But out on Apple, some of the people who have reviewed our podcast, thank you so much for your kind words, such as Baseball Bob, Show Daddy, and Gianna77. We do appreciate you. Your words are very kind. I'm glad that our podcast can be of help. And if you ever have questions for us, you can always reach out to us at vegantheology@gmail.com.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. It definitely is a journey that we feel very humbled to be sitting here talking to you, because so much of what we talk about, we're still trying to get our own minds around. We're still wrestling with, including what we're talking about today. We're continuing on with Andrew Remington Rillera's book. We finally sat down and watched one YouTube video that features a short interview with Andrew Rillera. And we realized we've been saying his name wrong this whole time.
Yep. Sorry about that.
So once
Dr.
again,
Rillera.
Yes, once again, we're not getting it all right the first time. Only God does that, and we're doing our best.
Right.
But yeah, I like pronouncing it Rillera as well. That sounds kind of cool too. So here we go.
Yeah.
We have reached chapter 5, which is very exciting. But I wanted, just for my sake, as well as maybe your sake, to give some highlights from the ground we've covered so far and look at where we're going. So if we remember, chapter 1, what Old Testament sacrifice is not. It is not about death. It is not about suffering. And it's not about substitution, which is huge. That third point is really huge, that Old Testament sacrifice is never about substitution. And then chapter 2, we learned about non-atoning sacrifices, including the twice daily burnt offerings, which are just to attract God's presence to the people, as well as the well-being celebratory feasts between God and the people. These are always commemorating something that God has done or that God is about to do for the people. And also within the umbrella or under the umbrella of the well-being sacrifices would be the covenant inaugurations or the covenant renewals. These sacrifices have nothing to do with atoning for sin or purifying anything. They are just attracting God's presence and then celebrating with God. Mm-hmm. And chapter 3, we did learn about atonement and purgative sacrifices, things that would purify, essentially, God's sanctuary. The purpose for them is decontaminating the sanctuary of God and all the sancta, all the items therein. That was really interesting as well. And then chapter 4, we learned about atonement in terms of how it focused a lot on how forgiveness happens outside of the sacrificial system. Forgiveness is God's prerogative, and it shows us who God is, the kind of God that God is. Yeah. God is forgiving. We learned how sacrifices have a very limited function. And one of the limitations is that sacrifice cannot deal with major moral impurities. And Rillera argues in that chapter that the prophets were really not anti-animal sacrifice, as many of us have read their message, but they are just pointing out that sacrifices cannot remedy the major moral impurity that's going on among the people.
And it's worth mentioning there are some prophetic texts that seem to really call out animal sacrifice in general, just FYI, but I think we're just making the point here that Rillera is making.
Yes, and we know that we are approaching this wonderful book. We have nothing but real respect, growing respect for Rillera and what he's doing in this book. And we know that it's, in some ways, a little bit unfair that we're coming to his book asking our own questions for our purposes
Right.
that his book is not intending to answer.
Right.
So it's a very interesting relationship we have with this book. We're coming to the text with our own questions, such as, could an all-loving God require people to kill innocent animals in their worship of God? And how much of animal sacrifice itself is just an artifact, to use your word, Kevin, just an artifact of ancient Near Eastern culture?
Yeah.
And so these are some of the questions that we're coming to the text with. And I continue to come to it with.
Right.
I continue to wrestle with the fact that it really feels like there's a lot of paganism going on, even in the Old Testament animal sacrifice system. I mean, we remember that in ancient Near Eastern religion, the purpose of humans was to serve the gods.
Right.
That was their only purpose for existence, was to take care of the gods, including housing them, feeding them, etc. And of course, our theology is that God does not need us to do anything for God. God doesn't need us to take care of God, right? But to me, I keep thinking, doesn't having to keep God's house clean from impurities for God sound like we're taking care of God's house? It's the same way the pagans thought that they had to. Again, to me, it sounds like paganism. Just like the burning the offerings twice a day to attract God's presence with this pleasing aroma, or feeding the gods with these well-being sacrifices. With all of these, I keep thinking these sacrifices are primarily something that God needed. They weren't really something that added value to the people or to their spiritual situation, their spiritual relationship with God. They weren't really benefiting the people. They were primarily, when you look at them all, they're primarily something that the people believed that God needed.
Yeah.
So again, it feels like it's just some of the same stuff that we were seeing in the ancient Near East overall. And even later in this chapter, Rillera does mention that Moses in Exodus, as early as Exodus 5, Moses mentions to Pharaoh that animal sacrifice was the stated goal of why they needed to be set free.
Right.
They needed to go on their exodus so they could go out and start sacrificing animals. That was Moses's primary argument for why they needed to be released. And whenever I think about that, I think, well, remember, Moses had just spent 40 years living with the Midianites.
Right.
He had married the Midianite high priest's daughter. And so he was very close. He was in the family of Jethro and, all of this ancient Near Eastern religion.
Right.
And so that's what he knew. That's
Right.
what Moses knew. That's what that was his culture.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
So I continue to wrestle with these questions. And I think the case that Rillera has laid out, that specifically around the limited usefulness of sacrifices, their limited role, that only strengthens our argument, I believe.
Yeah.
The fact that the majority of sacrifices bore no remedy for sins, and there was no sacrificial remedy for the major moral sins, it just strengthens our arguments that sacrifices were just a pagan holdover, and they really held little real value in the spiritual lives of the people. And that forgiveness, Rillera points out so beautifully, forgiveness does not come from sacrifices. Forgiveness has always been just the way God is. And God is able to extend forgiveness without the sacrifices.
Right.
So now the rest of the book is saying, okay, now that we've learned what we've learned about what Old Testament sacrifice is and all the different types of sacrifice and what the purposes of them were, now let's re-examine how the New Testament authors talk about Jesus' death And we're going to see it wildly different now,
Right.
which is so fun.
Right. And I think we've both commented that, or to ourselves anyway, that after reading Rillera's chapters on the Old Testament, it definitely changes the way that you will read the New Testament. And we've even said it makes the good news again.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, you start to see this hopeful existence, I think.
Oh, I know.
Kind of takes the fear out of it.
I love how, even in this chapter we're about to get into, the way he describes Jesus and the effect that Jesus has on everyone around him
Right.
is so exciting.
Yeah.
Fall in love with Jesus all over again.
Right.
Like, oh my goodness, I would give anything to be in the presence of this guy.
Right.
You know, this chapter 5, is titled Lamb of the Free. The title of the book is the title of this chapter, but it also talks about Jesus in relationship to the purity system and how Jesus's death is most often written about in the New Testament in association with the non-atoning sacrifices. So that's what this chapter is about. I think next chapter we get into how sometimes in the New Testament, Jesus' death is associated with the atoning sacrifices. Then the last real chapter is about how sometimes Jesus' death is written about without any sacrificial metaphor at all,
Yeah.
which will be really interesting as well. And then we'll go into the conclusion. So I love how this chapter starts out because it's very encouraging. He says, now that we have completed the heavy lifting and the ground clearing of both debunking common misconceptions and understandings the overall logic and functions of various sacrifices in the Old Testament, we can delve into the New Testament passages that use sacrificial imagery to understand the saving significance of Jesus' death. And we will see that Jesus' death is most often related to non-Kippur well-being sacrifices. That feels good to read, though, because I'll take any encouragement we can get at this point, because it's been a challenge.
Right.
I mean, this book is awesome,
Yeah.
but it's not easy.
Right.
And so
it's dense, and especially the last two chapters. Chapter 4 was about 60 pages. Chapter 5 is about 60 pages.
Yeah.
There's a lot there.
So maybe it goes without saying, but we're just going to say it anyway. We're not going to cover every single wonderful point that Rillera covers in these chapters. We just can't. So we're going to just try to hit.
But get your hands on a copy of this book.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So we have completed the heavy lifting and the ground clearing. So hopefully now it's just going to get a little bit easier as we go. So he points out that whenever Scripture addresses the death of Jesus, this was one of the big takeaways from this chapter for me, is that whenever we're reading the New Testament and the author is talking about Jesus' death, we need to stop and look for clues about what's the metaphor this author is using to help us get our minds around the significance of the death of Jesus. Because sometimes they do use sacrifice and sacrificial metaphors to describe Jesus' death. But we need to look closer. If they are using sacrificial metaphor, what sacrifices are they referencing? Because now we know there's different sacrifices with different purposes. And sometimes they're not using sacrificial metaphor at all. And yet traditionally, we've read sacrifice metaphor onto it. So this chapter is all about how in Scripture, Jesus' death is most often related to non-decontaminating well-being sacrifices. Or to put it another way, in Scripture, Jesus' death is usually not related to the decontaminating sacrifices. It's usually related to the well-being sacrifices. And I would just like to throw in there, even if the decontaminating sacrifices were the ones most associated with Jesus' death, it is worth noting, I think, to remember that the purposes of those decontaminating sacrifices was to purify the sanctuary, not people. Those sacrifices really didn't purify the people. And I know we're going to get into this more, but I just want to say it now as well, which is when Jesus himself explained the significance of his upcoming death, it was at the Lord's Supper. And he couched it within the context, within the metaphor, within the tradition of the Passover and the covenant inauguration / covenant renewal sacrifice. So Jesus himself associated his death with the well-being, non-atoning sacrifices at the Lord's Supper. I just wanted to read one thing he says later in the chapter about that last point. He says, therefore, when something like forgiveness is mentioned, it is exegetically irresponsible to simply equate this with kippur, since we now know the notion of forgiveness as it relates to the sacrificial system is extremely limited in scope. When analyzing any New Testament text about the saving significance of Jesus, we need to understand that there are other frameworks besides sacrifice and sacrificial kippur within which the authors might be trying to express the benefits Jesus brings and or the meaning of his death in particular. So again, now that we have a little bit more insight, thanks to Rillera, when we read about Jesus' death in the New Testament, we can look at it a lot more intelligently.
Right.
To identify, are they using sacrifice metaphor? And if so, what type of sacrifice are they referencing? As usual, Rillera starts out the chapter with several theses that he's going to take us through. And theses 1, 3, and 4 are all about how Rillera argues that Jesus was not bucking, if I could use that word, the kippur system. He was in alignment in Rillera's assessment with the kippur system, with the purifying kippur sacrifices that people were required to undergo after they had been ritually impure. He argues that Jesus expected others to follow those kippur rules to make sure the temple remained decontaminated. He says that Jesus is in line with the prophets. So if you remember from chapter 4, he was saying the prophets weren't against the kippur system. They were just saying it's limited and you're trying to get it to do things it wasn't designed to do. So he's saying, like the prophets, Jesus was not criticizing the temple per se. And you may not be surprised to know that, especially given our point of view as we approach this topic, that doesn't necessarily resonate for me or for us. I don't find his arguments completely convincing. He cites the times that Jesus told people, after he had healed them, he told them to go to the temple and fulfill the requirements. But I see that just as easily being explained by the fact that, it's well documented that Jesus was deliberately keeping a very low profile with the temple and with the priests. He was not trying to cause a lot of waves and upset the priests unduly or too early.
Right.
Because he had a ministry to accomplish. He had a mission that he knew was going to be cut short sooner or later by these priests getting upset with him and what he was saying.
Right.
And so...
And doing.
Yes. And so for him to be like, oh, don't even worry about going and sacrificing to, since you've been ritually impure, but now I've fixed that for you. To me, it's just as easy to explain that he was trying to not upset the authorities too soon. Of course, gradually, he does start confronting the priests more and more.
Right.
Until ultimately, when he goes to Jerusalem for the last Passover, the last week of his life, he's very in their face. The first thing he does is walk in and cleanse the temple.
Right. And I do think in chapter 6, Rillera talks about, from the book of Hebrews, there's a sense that the same temple sancta, the whole setup that's in the physical temple, might be in the heavenly temple. And now Christ is the high priest, and he goes through the rituals by his death, resurrection, and ascension, and sitting at the right hand of God, that he is continually the high priest. Mm-hmm. And so I find it fascinating, and we'll get to this probably next podcast, but I just want to make that point that it's possible that all Rillera is doing is he's just describing and making the argument from what he might be getting from the book of Hebrews, mm-hmm. that this is what Hebrews says. And of course, we would probably, again, I don't want to get to the next podcast, but Hebrews is referencing what's happening in the Levitical system. So
Mhm. Clear that Jesus was very, very aware of and was working within the culture.
Right.
And so sometimes it's hard to parse out how much of it is he just respecting people's culture and how much of it is he actually totally on board with and
Right.
supporting 100%.
Well, there's also the passage in the opening chapter 1 or chapter 2 of Hebrews where it says, Jesus says, I did not come to overthrow the prophets and the law.
Yeah.
I came to fulfill them. So he obviously is respecting them to a point. I think you and I were having this discussion that he's respecting them to fulfill them, but then he's superseding them and almost making them worthless.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah, it seems like there's definitely rendering them obsolete.
Yes.
And coming up with something that's so superior.
Right. And the only way that he could do that is to fulfill the law exactly. Right.
Yeah. There are scholars. It's not like we're just throwing out all scholarship. There are scholars who do believe that Jesus was not adherent to the temple sacrificial system, and he wasn't in alignment. I mean, we could name drop, I guess. N.T. Wright is one of them that has published work on this very point.
Right. Jesus and the Victory of God.
Clearly, Jesus had many criticisms of the temple and the priests and the way they were operating at the time that he was walking the earth.
Right.
So to me, it's clear that they certainly had become part of the problem, not part of the solution. And this might be a question we have for Rillera, just to discuss more. Why is this an important point in his mind?
Right. Well, it's funny too, and again, I don't want to go too far off track, but when Jesus does cleanse the temple eventually, it reminds me almost of possibly like in the Reformation time with Martin Luther, where he was having an issue with the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences. Like it turned into something abusive. And I wonder if the same thing was happening in the early temple.
Right.
That abuse was happening and people were being manipulated and exploited. Yes, people were being exploited for money, and they kind of spiritualized it and made people buy these sacrifices. And so it could be that maybe from Rillera's point or other scholars that that's what Jesus was upset with, this abuse of power.
Yeah.
Possibly.
For sure. We would agree with that too. So the theses that he names that are not about how Jesus was in alignment with the purity system are definitely worth looking at. One of them is Jesus was a source of contagious holiness that nullified the sources of the major ritual impurities as well as moral impurity. There's a lot in that. First of all, that phrase, contagious holiness.
Right.
I absolutely love that phrase. And that he not only nullified the sources of the major ritual impurities, and if you remember, those are being around a corpse or being around someone who has scale disease or genital discharges. He not only nullifies the sources of those ritual impurities, he also nullifies moral impurity just by his contagious holiness, his presence, which is so beautiful. As soon as I read that and throughout the chapter, I was like, do we have the capacity? Do we have the potential of having contagious holiness wherever we go as followers of Jesus? Because that's something that really captures the imagination. And also, Rillera says Jesus' followers will be able to experience the moral purification he offers. And the next one is a big one. The only sacrificial interpretation of Jesus' death that is attributed to Jesus himself, we kind of already discussed this, the only sacrificial interpretation of Jesus' death that is attributed to Jesus himself occurs at the Lord's Supper. At this meal, Jesus combines two communal well-being sacrifices, the Passover and a covenant inauguration ceremony, to explain the importance of his death. There are several other New Testament texts that reiterate these claims. However, the notion of Kippur is not used in any of these accounts, despite some attempts to read that into the descriptions. So again, several New Testament authors refer to Jesus' death couched in the context of the Passover feast and these well-being sacrifices, the Passover and the covenant inauguration ceremony, which are celebrations of what God is doing, and kippur, or purification, or atonement, are not used in any of those biblical accounts, even though we have put those onto them.
Right.
And then following that one, he goes into one he doesn't list as one of his theses, but in my mind it is. He starts talking about the participatory nature of Jesus' death. And I think this is very key.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the strong points of this book. There are many, but here we go. Throughout these discussions, an important theme will emerge that will only be reinforced in each subsequent chapter. The New Testament appropriates sacrificial imagery, both non-atoning and atoning, to Jesus, not only to make certain claims about the saving significance of Jesus, but also to encourage a certain pattern of life for Jesus' followers that is best described as participatory. These sacrificial interpretations are not about Jesus dying a substitutionary death. They are about helping followers of Jesus understand that they are called to follow Jesus precisely in the sense that they imitate and unite with Jesus' cruciform or cross-shaped life that culminated in his crucifixion. Jesus himself made this clear. That would be Mark 8:34-38, Mark 10:38-39. Living a cruciform life is the only way to participate and share in Jesus' death, and thereby share also in his resurrection. Philippians 2:5-11 and 3:10-11.
Yes. So I like how he's juxtaposing substitution with participation. And I think that that's really key. When we misunderstand Jesus' death as substituting for us, it doesn't really call us into anything. But when we understand Jesus' death as participating with us and something that we can participate with him in, it does call us into a lot.
Right.
It calls us into living this cross-shaped life. And I think that's actually how he finishes this chapter. We'll be coming back to this point, obviously, that to the degree to which our life is shaped like the cross is the degree that we are participating with Christ in his death and his resurrection. So
Right.
the first section of this chapter is subheaded, Jesus overcomes the forces of death. And I absolutely love this content. Jesus overcomes the forces of death. So we're going to read just a little bit from that section.
But this also plays nicely into the earlier points in Leviticus about his argument about death, right? Like, I don't know if you thought of it, but as I was reading this and obviously into chapter 6 and 7, yeah, you really start to see that whatever Leviticus was trying to do, emphasizing death, Jesus is overcoming all forms of death.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty powerful stuff.
Yes.
When you read it.
I love it. Let's read from this portion. Ultimately, the Gospels claim that Jesus is the kind of being and has the type of holy life that necessarily overwhelms not only the forces of death, but death itself by means of his own resurrection. As Thiessen expresses it, quote, this dramatic story culminates in Jesus facing off with death itself in his crucifixion, taking ritual impurity into his very own body, only once again and with finality to come out victorious when Israel's God raises him from the dead. That is, the resurrection can be understood within the framework of the purity system as the ultimate purification from death. Mm-hmm. Jesus confronts ritual impurity by healing people. So he heals someone with scale disease. He raises a corpse. He heals a woman with abnormal genital discharge. So he's coming against these things that the people would all understand that these are the things that contaminate us and contaminate God's holy place. Yeah. And Jesus instead just comes right up to them. And instead of them contaminating him and making him ritually impure, he heals them and obliterates the contamination.
It's pretty amazing.
And it wasn't just ritual impurity that Jesus could destroy. It was also moral impurity. Rillera writes, this moral purification is not due to Jesus' death per se, though this is part of it, but more because of who he is as the source of contagious, holy purification. Jesus' death and resurrection is still part of this whole framework because it proves he can not only purify scale disease, for instance, but also his life is the kind of life that cannot be held down by death. His life nullifies death itself. The point is, just as it is the nature of Jesus' very being that purifies ritual impurities that contact Jesus, it is Jesus' very being that makes him powerful enough to remove moral impurities. It's like just him being here amongst people. He's already purifying people, both ritually and morally. Like it's just flowing out of him.
Right.
He's already forgiving. He's already offering forgiveness of sins to everyone.
Yeah, and also it's worth noting Mark's title for Jesus, the Holy One of God. It parallels Leviticus 21:23 from the Septuagint, and you may remember the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Here it says, Mark's gospel portrays Jesus' holiness, removing the conditions that give rise to ritual impurities in others. Contact with Jesus, the Holy One of God, causes a discharge of holiness to surge out of Jesus, a holiness that overpowers the source of impurity in the one touching Jesus. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, and I appreciate that Rillera points out that this is different than what was going on in the Old Testament with the Sancta, right? The Sancta in the Old Testament, the way it was understood in the Old Testament was that the Sancta was almost like a magnet that attracted any ritual impurity in the air. Right? And even that, I feel like we should have some theological questions about that because Jesus comes and he's referred to as, let's just see what he calls him. His very flesh is like another mobile dwelling place, except that it cannot be defiled. It can only purify. Like we need to ask ourselves, can God be contaminated? Can we contaminate God?
No.
So this, again, this idea of the sanctuary, the temple that we have to keep clean for God feels very pagan, the pagan understanding of how we are here to take care of God.
And I don't want to cut you off, but when I was reading those chapters about this sanctuary in Leviticus attracting contamination, like it was a magnet for contamination, it just reminded me of all the crazy horror movies and superhero movies that we've seen where this force just throws something against a wall or whatever. You know what I mean? It did seem very, I don't know, animistic, shamanistic. It had a pagan flavor to it. Almost to the point where the priest, to me, seemed more like shaman than priest because of the pagan flavor. But this is pretty amazing. And to me, this point that Christ cannot be contaminated, but that he can only decontaminate, to me, that's a strong point about his omnipotence and his power over the forces of all creation, right? And so to me, it's a great point for classical theism.
Yeah, and it's very different than the theology we were getting from Leviticus.
Yes.
Because Jesus cannot be defiled. And the next line says, whereas the instructions for ritual impurity in the Torah were defensive against impurity, Jesus goes on the offensive. I love that. Jesus goes on the offensive against the powers of death. He talks about Mark a little more here. He says, by calling Jesus the Holy One of God, and then showing how a holy power emanates out of Jesus' body and can overcome all sources of impurity, the Gospels declare that Jesus embodies God's holiness let loose on the earth.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's what God's holiness looks like, who wouldn't want that?
Right.
And again, how different is that than what we get in Leviticus in terms of the holiness of God? It's not something to fear. It's something that brings life and vanquishes death. Going on, as Peter in Acts later says, God raised him up, releasing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for him to be conquered by it. That is, Jesus was resurrected because he has the type of holy life that necessarily overwhelms not only the forces of death that generate ritual impurity, but death itself, the consequence of moral impurity. So, of course, just as the paralytic walking out of the house healed proved that Jesus has the authority to forgive sins, to effect purification for sins defiling the land, Jesus walking out of the tomb proves it all the more. And he starts to make the finer point about the Lord's Supper and what Jesus is doing there at the Lord's Supper. It's a ritual intimation of the communal thanksgiving and well-being sacrifices of Passover and a covenant inauguration or renewal, which memorializes that victory over the forces of impurity and celebrates it, but does not bring it about. That's so important. And I'm just still getting my head around this. When Jesus celebrates the Last Supper with his disciples, it's not that the sacrifice is the thing that brings about this new covenant. The sacrifice is just a celebration of what God has already done and is doing and is about to do.
Right.
Going on, that is, there is a difference between the meaning of Jesus' death qua death and the meaning of Jesus qua sacrifice. The New Testament authors express the saving significance of Jesus in a variety of ways. But when it comes to Jesus' death as death, they do not use sacrificial imagery. Since, as we learned, sacrifice is not about the concept of death. Sacrificial imagery is used for expressing other meanings of Jesus' entire life and resurrection and ascension.
The point here is that Jesus' death and resurrection are comprehended within the framework of moral purification, and that this is distinct from thinking about Jesus in terms of sacrificial imagery. When Jesus' death is framed as a sacrificial event in the Gospels, during the Lord's Supper, it is viewed as the sacrificial meal of celebration for the end of the curse brought about by Israel's moral impurity and the ratification of the new covenant. Jesus as sacrifice is not the saving event itself from this angle, but rather, like the first Passover, the proleptic ritual celebration of the deliverance immediately about to take place. Jesus' death is saving only insofar as it is seen in tandem with the resurrection, whereby just as when Jesus encountered major ritual impurities, he vanquished them and was not affected by them, so too the resurrection is proof that A, when Jesus encountered death itself, he vanquished it, and therefore B, he is the promised agent of moral purification, the one who is able to forgive the most heinous of sins that drag the entire community and the land into the covenant curse of death.
This is why we said this chapter makes the good news sound really, really good again.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing here. I think I'm trying to remember. I think I maybe have heard Father Richard Rohr say on a video, like if people really were told the good news the way it is, nobody would turn away from that. Nobody would be an atheist. Like it's basically full liberty, full freedom, full life, freedom from all these forces of death that plague us.
Yeah.
Like that is what God is offering us, is freedom and life. I mean, he continues to build this beautiful case that Jesus is not substituting himself for us. He is participating with us in the muck and the mire and the effects of the forces of death so that he can have victory
Right.
and vanquish those forces of
And
death.
he's leading the way. He's leading us out of the muck and the mire.
Yes.
Yeah. So here's from Rillera's book. Like Ezekiel, Jesus does not suffer as a substitute, but as a prophetic place sharer. Since his death is his proleptic experience of Jerusalem's looming destruction, his resurrection therefore signals Israel's resurrection, and thus their restoration, the forgiveness of their grave sins. And that's from, he references Ezekiel 37. And now we have come full circle with Jesus' mission to be the agent of moral purification. But this is not because Jesus' death is a sacrifice, let alone a kippur sacrifice, but rather because by experiencing actual death, Jesus is able to make direct contact with the consequences of moral impurity and exhaust them, evidenced by his resurrection from the dead. On analogy, to show how he is able to make direct contact with ritual impurity and thereby heal it by the contagious holiness of his very being.
Just like we have already established, when Jesus contacts ritual impurities, he purifies them. As the Gospels present Jesus' teaching, activity, and eventual explanation of his death at the Lord's Supper, it is clear that Jesus believes he can only bring the moral purification Israel needs by making contact with the deepest consequences of moral impurity, touching death, and experiencing God's abandonment of the temple in himself, and then defeating that death in his resurrection. It is worth pausing to note that Jesus repeatedly tells his disciples that they are called to follow him along the same way. This conception of Jesus' death is not a substitution from any angle. Jesus did not die instead of Jerusalem, since it is still going to be destroyed. Jesus did not die instead of the disciples, who will still be brought to trial and some of them killed. Jesus goes the way of Jerusalem's destruction on the cross, and Jesus' disciples follow the way of the cross as they pick up their own. This is about solidarity, not substitution. According to the Gospels, Jesus is not dying instead of anyone, let alone his disciples, but rather ahead of them. He is the one who pioneers the way through death and into indestructible resurrection life, moral purification, the forgiveness of sins, and the establishment of the new eschatological covenant.
Wow. And we should have mentioned, too, not only are there waterfowl and chimes, but there are also motorboats out on this lake.
Yeah, I hope it's
Maybe
not too noisy, everybody.
not.
Thanks for sticking with us
Yeah.
through our rustic environs. This new covenant, the covenant that the prophets said was coming, there was going to come forgiveness, and there was going to come cleansing, and there was going to come a new covenant. And Jesus is fulfilling all of that. And we see that really memorialized, right, at that Last Supper. One thing I've never heard anyone discuss or unpack theologically or even take note of, they're celebrating the first Passover, right? They're celebrating, and they're also celebrating the first covenant inauguration at Mount Sinai. I believe it was the Mount Sinai. And it's so interesting and significant to me that Jesus doesn't say, okay, this wine is my blood and this animal body is my body.
Right.
Which would seem to be more consistent with the tradition that they would already understand.
Right.
He doesn't use an animal's body in this metaphor, in this explanation, in this sacred moment of explaining this new covenant that it has been inaugurated. No, he takes the unleavened bread and breaks it and says, this is my body, and this is how I want you to remember that what I've done. This is how I want you to celebrate going forward and memorialize what I'm doing.
Right.
In this well-being sacrifice where we get together and we remember what God has done. I want you to use bread and wine, not an animal's body and wine. And I think that sounds pretty significant. But again, I've never heard anybody else wonder about that.
Well, no, I think it is. considering where it's coming from based on, I think, what Rillera is saying, right?
It is significant? Is that what you're saying?
It's significant what you're saying. The argument that Rillera is making is that Christ has become this well-being sacrifice, right? He's all of them, but he's also that. And in that sacrifice, right, just what you're saying, they use an animal, but how come Christ himself doesn't use an animal? I think it is significant as well. It's like, what's going on?
We need to find more about that. Or,
well, I think it just makes our point that the Levitical system was pagan.
or that, yeah, Jesus is moving beyond sacrificing animals into something more peaceful.
And I think it's what we've said. It comes up probably almost every episode. We talk about contextualization. God meets people where they are and then moves them beyond that. Yeah. And God contextualizes. He also makes concessions to connect with people, build a relationship, and then move people beyond their cultural significances and their cultural and their pagan ways.
Which is what any good teacher does. First, you find out what your student knows and understands. And you start by using the language that they already know and understand, and then you move them into something new.
Right.
So God is, obviously he knows out of his loving kindness what will help us and what wouldn't help us.
Right.
He has to start with what we understand.
Right. Totally makes sense.
So as a kind of a reminder, we've been here before, but this is where he really brings home the point that, remember, if people are partaking of this sacrifice, if it's an eating sacrifice, it is a celebratory sacrifice. It is not about purifying anything. It's not about atoning for anything. So the fact that this is a celebration in which everyone is partaking, everyone is ingesting, means that it would be very confusing to the people at the Lord's Supper if Jesus was trying to get them to eat an atoning sacrifice. That would just be, It would not make any sense.
Right.
So the fact that they're eating it points very clearly that this is a non-atoning well-being sacrifice.
Yeah.
And that the Lord's Supper shows up in Matthew, Mark, Luke, so the Synoptic Gospels, as well as 1 Corinthians. But we're going to get into how John also contributes to this idea. But as we said, the prophets have been saying that there is a forgiveness coming. There will be God bringing a new covenant, a new washing, a new purification, where all major moral impurities will be cleansed, and a new covenant is coming. Let's read a little bit from Rillera about that. Since many of the prophetic expectations of the renewed covenant include the notion of forgiveness of sins that produce moral impurity, this means the establishment of the renewed covenant entails and signifies that God has granted this promised forgiveness from these sins apart from any kippur sacrifice. The establishment of the renewed covenant is a celebration and proof that God's forgiveness has already happened. Remember, that was the whole point of what he's saying about the prophets, is there cannot be any forgiveness that comes from the kippur sacrifices. That was a problem with what Israel was trying to do.
Right.
So the fact that Jesus is inaugurating this new covenant shows that the forgiveness is already here. The forgiveness is already flowing out from him. And then if you remember, like lots of times there's imagery of us being sprinkled with Jesus's blood. Well, again, that's very consistent with a covenant inauguration sacrifice where the people are sprinkled with blood. It's not an atonement that they're receiving. It's a metaphysical transition into being God's people and being a part of this covenant. If you remember, like some of the blood was sprinkled on the people and some of the blood was sprinkled on the altar. It's just a way of saying God is in this covenant and you are in this covenant. It's like a visual aid, really. And so he says it's affecting a metaphysical transition. The blood of the sacrificed animals was used to seal the covenant between the Israelites and God in the Exodus and was sprinkled on the people to index and mark the transition of the people into this covenant relationship with God. So too, Jesus' death is thus the sacrifice that seals the covenant between his followers and God. This is a really important paragraph here where he helps us examine again when we're reading about Jesus' death to really look at what is being used as explanation, metaphors, and what's not there. So this is why we need to be careful to distinguish between the meaning and function attributed to Jesus' death as a death versus the meaning of Jesus as a sacrifice. These are not equivalent. But the very nature of ascribing various types of meaning to one event, the crucifixion of Jesus by Romans, means the associations are going to require subtlety and nuance. When viewed from the perspective of the ethical shape impressed upon Jesus' followers, his death is the pattern for the form of life they are to inhabit and cultivate among one another. So that's one thing that can be going on in describing Jesus' death. Similarly, when viewed from the perspective of moral purification, Jesus' death is saving because it is by Jesus' direct contact with death itself, while having the type of life that cannot be held down by death to decay, that made it possible for him to swallow up death and emerge victorious over it, and thereby able to effect the moral purification from grave sins. The very sins the law of Moses itself says there is no sacrificial or ritual remedy for. So number one, it can be pointing to an ethical way of living, the way Jesus lived, like a cross-shaped life. Number two, Jesus' death is the fact that he came into direct contact with death and had victory over it because of the kind of life he lived. He was able to swallow up death and emerge victorious. And then three, but when Jesus' death is viewed from the perspective of these well-being sacrifices, these memorialize his victory over all sins and death by means of a shared sacrificialized meal, drawing upon Passover and the covenant inauguration ceremony. The emphasis on the sacrificial aspect is not about what causes the saving event, but how that divine deliverance is remembered, commemorated, and celebrated.
Continuing on, obviously, the institution of the Lord's Supper by Jesus happened before that final victory took place by his resurrection. But this is no different than the way the first Passover was presented in Exodus 12, before the actual exodus out of Egypt happened. Thus, both the first Passover and Jesus' institution of the Lord's Supper are proleptic anticipations of a full deliverance that is imminent. But importantly, both are also celebrating a deliverance that has already started. Israel's deliverance from the first 9 plagues anticipate the full deliverance from Egypt to come just as Jesus' miracles healing ritual impurities, the forces of death, and restoring people's bodies to health, even after some have died, declaring forgiveness, all anticipate the full deliverance from death, the full moral purification to come.
If you think about that,
It fits in with our theology, with the already not yet.
Yes.
It fits in with everything we already know.
we're very careful not to curse on this show, and I don't want to curse.
Well, we don't curse, so I mean...
But the phrase that's coming to my mind, so forgive me if...
Uh-oh. Oh, no.
Bleep. No, the phrase that's coming to mind is, how badass is that? That we're celebrating something because God is about to do something. Like this word proleptic, like Jesus is doing all of this stuff. We're celebrating this Last Supper before he's been arrested and tortured and killed, and before he is resurrected and ascended. We're already celebrating. It hasn't even really gotten started, and we're celebrating. The way the Passover is like a celebration of the coming deliverance from slavery. I mean, it's like this faith-filled, like we know God's got this. Like we may still be in slavery as the Israelites who haven't been released yet.
Right.
We may still not know exactly how God is going to save us and ultimately bring his kingdom here and ultimately make all things good and redeem all things and bring back everything that's been wasted and destroyed. We're not there yet, but we're already going to celebrate. it's really, I don't know what the word is. It's just amazing and beautiful.
Yeah.
Those are the two words I can come up with. Those are the only two words I
Or
can.
is somewhere in the
Words fail me.
somewhere in the vernacular a few years ago, people were saying that's boss, right? Like, I think it's similar. I think
Yeah.
that's a different generation.
Even the phrase that Jesus uses at the Last Supper, "This is my blood poured out for you." People have tended to see that phrase poured out and think animal sacrifice imagery. And Rillera does a really great job of showing how that phrase, the particular word that's being used there, has no sacrificial connection. That phrase, more faithfully translated or understood, actually means murder. When he says, "This is my blood poured out for you," he's pointing to the fact that he is going to be murdered. And I know that, at least in my background, I feel like theologically people have really stressed in my life that Jesus was not a victim of murder. Jesus was not a victim. Jesus was not murdered. His life was not taken from him involuntarily. You know, the idea that Jesus was in complete control, which I do agree with.
Right.
I do agree that Jesus willingly allowed himself to die, but both can be true.
Right.
The method of death was a murder, right? And that word connects him. It's an intentional link between the murder of Jesus and the murder of the prophets. It's the same concept there. And I like this paragraph. He writes, "And the value of construing Jesus' execution as a murder is not just that poured out is not alluding to Leviticus, but more about how Jesus' death can plausibly be understood by others at the time as a justified or lawful capital punishment carried out by the Roman authorities. That would have been the default position for many people at the time. This is just like when someone is killed by police. There are many whose first reaction is, what law did they break? What crime did they commit to deserve that? While others protest, this was actually a murder. In an effort to combat the idea that being crucified by the Roman authorities is a justified capital punishment, the Synoptic Gospels narrate how Jesus' execution should be understood as a murder of an innocent, righteous person, no less. And of course, that is what makes it so wonderful, because to the world, one thing is going on, but to God, something else is going on.
Right.
There's this portion that's in this chapter that says, what is most shocking about this portrayal is that at the very moment that the forces of impurity seem to have finally beaten Jesus, at the precise instant that Jesus becomes a corpse and presumably a source of corpse contamination, holy power emanates out of him and into the abode of death, tombs, to snatch away bodies who were themselves sources of ritual impurity. Whereas corpses usually emit some miasma of impurity, Jesus' corpse appears to emit a miasma of holy power that selectively revivifies long dead saints. The world thinks they have the control. They've finally beaten Jesus.
Right.
But actually something completely bigger in a totally other stratosphere is going on.
Also reading from Rillera. The Lord's Supper, therefore, celebrates that God has fulfilled the covenant promise to bring an end to the covenant curses for Israel's sin, i.e. forgiveness, by Jesus' direct contact with Israel's covenant death. But it is not Jesus as well being sacrifice that accomplishes this. Rather, this happens through Jesus' actual death and resurrection. The Lord's Supper remembers this event via a sacrificialized ritual meal. As Schaff says, the Romans killed Jesus in a ritual of execution, but the Christian ritual of the Lord's Supper transforms the meaning of Jesus' death for the celebrants from execution to sacrifice. It is Jesus' death as execution that brings about the deliverance, but it is Jesus as well being sacrifice that celebrates that salvation wrought by his death, qua death.
I love that part, what you just read. Like, the Romans killed Jesus in a ritual of execution, but the Christian ritual of the Lord's Supper transforms the meaning of Jesus' death from execution to sacrifice. So as we've mentioned, the Lord's Supper and New Testament authors that describe the Lord's Supper are the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it's also described in 1 Corinthians. We're going to look at how Rillera also mentions that the Gospel of John has some interesting things about, he doesn't really have the Lord's Supper account, but he does obviously say some things about the death of Jesus and leading up to it. And then also we're going to look at how in the book of Revelation, it's also a Last Supper metaphor for Jesus. So in the Gospel of John, interestingly, in the other Gospels, the Lord's Supper occurs on Passover, and Jesus is crucified the following day. But in John, Jesus is crucified the day before the Passover, which is called the Day of Preparation, which is when all of the Passover lambs were sacrificed at the temple. Further, Jesus' death sentence occurs at noon, which is around the time of day the Paschal lambs were being sacrificed. Therefore, Lamb of God, which is what John calls Jesus, is primarily about Jesus as the ultimate Passover lamb. That's really interesting that John has Jesus being executed at the same time that all this Passover lambs would have been being killed.
That's very interesting.
Another important point that comes from John is the fact that Rillera points out that male lambs are never used for any purgation sacrifice. So that hasn't really come up before, I don't think, but that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So to use the metaphor that Jesus is the Lamb of God, the Hebrew would not have immediately thought, oh, this is a kippur that connection wouldn't have been there, that this is an atoning sacrifice, because male lambs were never used for any purgation sacrifice. Thus, it would be odd for John to call Jesus a male lamb if he was hoping people would associate that with a purgation sacrifice. If John wanted to link Jesus with the purgation sacrifices or the day of decontamination, then he should have used the bull of God or the goats of God.
The third thing that stuck out to us with regard to the Gospel of John is in John 1:29, Rillera says, the larger point of John 1:29 is to combine these distinct identity claims as having one and the same personal referent, namely Jesus, this most unlikely of candidates who comes from Nazareth. John 1:29 is a declaration that Jesus of Nazareth is both the liberator of a new exodus from the entire cosmos, i.e., the ultimate Passover lamb, and as the embodiment of God, the one who will take away the sins of the cosmos.
Yeah. I love that John uses the word cosmos, and I know Rillera gets into this more in the next chapter.
Yeah.
And I'm excited for that because, again, we've been kind of trying to come up against this anthropocentric theology that God only cares about one species on this planet.
Right.
God so loved all the people that he sent his only begotten son. No, John uses this word cosmos. God so loved the cosmos that he sent his son.
Yeah.
And here, that Jesus takes away the sins of the cosmos. I mean, to me, this just, my heart opens and I immediately start resonating that God loves without limits and that everything is going to be, because of his care and his love and his concern for creation, everything is included in his plan of redemption. Rillera spends some time also in the book of Revelation. This is another place where the Lord's Supper, the Passover, the covenant inauguration is the language around the death of Jesus and the significance about Jesus' death and resurrection. It's all couched in these well-being, non-atoning sacrifices. Another thing that he brings out from the book of Revelation is this idea of ransom, which I think is really a good point, because we hear the word ransom and our theology has taken that like, oh, someone had to be paid off. This debt was owed our debt of sin, right? And Jesus had to come die in order to pay off this debt, ransom us. And Rillera points out that when the authors use the word ransom, there's no literal payment going to anyone. That language is used when God ransoms Israel from Egypt.
Mm.
And there was no literal payoff. Pharaoh was not paid
Right.
for the freedom of the Hebrew people. And so likewise, when the New Testament authors use the word ransom, that we have been ransomed from the forces of death, it's not like somebody was actually paid. So sometimes our theology takes that word and we see it as, well, Jesus paid the debt to Satan, or
Right.
Jesus paid the debt to God. And that is definitely problematic because it makes God seem like this unloving, wrathful, scary entity that demands payment that we owe him. And
Right.
Jesus is like, oh, the sympathetic one
Right.
of the Trinity,
Right.
who's like, I'll do it. I'll take care of it. I'll pay that debt. It almost puts members of the Trinity against each other.
Yeah.
It's really confusing theologically in terms of how we feel about God, right? So I think it's really a good point that he brings up, that nobody's getting paid off in this word of ransom. And so it's not literal. Nobody's getting paid off. But it made me think about, and he also brings up the point that whenever Jesus talks about the forgiveness, like it's always debt forgiveness. It's never debt being paid, right? In the Gospels, in the parables, even in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. It's not make sure our debtors pay us in full.
Right.
It's just we will forgive our debtors, and please forgive us our debts. It's just debt forgiveness. And we were having this conversation with someone a few days ago, and they were like, I don't know. Like, even if the debt is forgiven, it's still being paid. It's being paid by the person who was offended.
Right.
The more I thought about that, the more I was like, that's exactly what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is I take the hit. You could say I pay the debt so that you don't have to.
Right.
I lose out here.
I was just going to say loss. Like there's a sense.
I take the loss.
Yeah, there's a sense where you've lost something, but in reality, I guess that's one way to look at it. But another way to look at it is like you've just given life.
Exactly.
You've just transformed this transaction, this relationship, this creation into life.
Yeah. For many years, to be honest with you, I have thought so much about the word forgiveness. And by the way, like when he talks about having a cruciform life, a cross-shaped life, I can think of no better way for us to take on a cross-shaped life than having a life of forgiveness, extending forgiveness. That to me is having a cross-shaped life.
Right.
And yeah, years ago, I remember thinking, man, we need to do more work in the church of coming up with language and coming up with understanding and better teachings around this concept of forgiveness. Because to believe that there are some things that are not forgivable is discounting the cross. It's
Right.
discounting what God has done. God shows us there isn't anything that's unforgivable. God has a capacity to forgive everything.
Right.
And so can we. Nothing is unforgivable. And of course, it costs us a lot to forgive. But like you
Right.
said, it's powerful because we are giving life.
It's also, I mean, obviously, our conversations made me think of the year of Jubilee and when things are reset and debts are forgiven and people start over. And you can think about it like, well, this person who was owed this debt loses that debt, but so many other people gained from it. Like it's a reset. And what it also does is it levels the playing field to some degree. It's almost like the way things are supposed to be. Like there's supposed to be this equity across the board for everyone. And we shouldn't have to worry about the unevenness of life, American life, capitalistic life. You know what I mean? There's so many inequities in our society that we see every day. And yet, if we instituted something like a Jubilee system, that would be transformative.
Yeah.
And I'm sure because of the forces of evil, that will never happen, right?
Well, not never, but
Not within our current political system, that right. I meant under the governance of humans.
yes. Exactly. Well, under the forces of death,
Right.
basically. Yeah, I remember one time we were watching a documentary about the civil rights movement, and especially how many people in the civil rights movement took on this philosophy of nonviolence. Like, as soon as we start returning violence for violence, we've lost.
Yeah.
And we've become just as evil as the forces that we're fighting against. And I know Martin Luther King Jr., for example, had spiritual teachers around him that were teaching him the concepts of nonviolent protesting. And one of the phrases I just remember to this day, it sticks out to me, was this idea of absorb their violence. Like when their violence comes at you, just absorb the violence. And I still don't feel like I completely have my head around that. But again, it's this idea of when we internalize, instead of returning it back, we're transforming that violence into something else. I think we need to do a lot more learning around the subject of forgiveness. I think it's very central and very important to this cross-shaped life. But that's one phrase that I come back to sometimes is absorb the insult.
Right, the injustice. But again, it's life-giving. It transforms relationships. You forgive somebody. Some people who know that they've done wrong and they want forgiveness, it tortures them. The guilt, the shame, or whatever it is. Some people are just demoralized. And
even if they're not repentant, when they're faced with someone's forgiveness, there's an opportunity there for them to have their lives changed. Whereas if you just return violence for violence and get revenge on them, what opportunity is there for them to see something new?
Right. No, exactly. And what does it do? It just continues to perpetuate the violence. I appreciate the discussion, Sarah.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful. And thanks for listening. And thanks for bearing through the chimes and the motorboats.
Yeah.
And the waterfowl.
And I can't wait to get on to the next few chapters.
Yeah.
I think this book is just going to get juicier and juicier and more life-giving. So
Absolutely.
see you guys next time.
Yeah, later.